Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Chapter 1. A New Place. 1801. I have just visited my landlord. He is the only neighbor that I may have trouble with. Mr. Heathcliff, a capital fellow. When I saw his black eyes stare suspiciously as I rode up, my heart warmed towards him. "Mr. Heathcliff," I said, "I'm Mr. Lockwood, your new tenant, sir. With the hope of not disturbing you, I'd like to call as soon as possible, after my arrival, to ask for the occupation of Thrushcross Grange." I heard. "Thrushcross Grange is my own, sir," he interrupted. "Walk in." He said the walk in with closed teeth, and it sounded like he had meant, "Go to the devil," but I accepted the invitation because I felt interested in this distant man. As we entered the court, he called Joseph to take my horse and bring up some wine. Joseph was a very old man, but he was strong and fit. Wuthering Heights is the name of Mr. Heathcliff's dwelling. Wuthering describes loud and wild atmospheric situations in stormy weather. The north wind blows over the edge at all times. Fortunately, the architect built it strong. The narrow windows are deeply set in the wall, and the corners defended with large jutting stones. Before passing the threshold, I paused to look at a quantity of grotesque carving, which consists of fabulous creatures with heads and wings of eagles and bodies of lions. I saw the date, 1500, and the name, Hareton Earnshaw, above them. Then we entered into the family sitting room that includes kitchen and parlor generally. I observed no signs of roasting, boiling, or baking about the fireplace, nor any sparkle of copper saucepans on the walls. There was both light and heat from ranks of dishes towering row after row on a vast shelf. Above the chimney were old guns and a couple of horse pistols. The floor was made of smooth white stone. The chairs were painted green. There was also a dog sleeping with puppies around her. An apartment like this and a man like Mr. Heathcliff can be easily seen within 5 or 6 miles among these hills. However, he forms contrast to his style of living. He is a dark-skinned gentleman and looks rather melancholic. I guess he dislikes showing his feelings. That may be the reason why he stands aloof. These are the suppositions I have made up. He may have completely different reasons. Just as we took our seats at the end of the hearthstone with my landlord, the dog came and snuck to the back of my legs. When Mr. Heathcliff went downstairs to tell Joseph to take the dog, I stayed alone with her. These moments made both of us uncomfortable, and she finally leapt on my knees. Upon my attempt to put the table between us, 6 more of them appeared. Fortunately, a maiden, working in the kitchen, came to my help. Using the frying pan as a weapon, she made the dogs calm. Rushing into the room in an inhospitable manner, my landlord claimed that his dogs do not disturb anyone as long as he does not touch anything. Then he said with a relaxing smile on his face, "Come on, Mr. Lockwood, take a little wine. My dogs and I hardly know how to receive guests in this house, as we rarely have them. Your health, sir." I bowed, thinking that it would be foolish to sit sulking. We began to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of settling in such a place. I enjoyed the conversation and even wanted to make another visit for tomorrow. Apparently, he did not agree with me. Compared with him, I was much more sociable than him. Chapter 2. The Strange Household. Yesterday afternoon it was very cold and misty, so I decided to spend the day by the fire. However, I changed my mind when I saw the servant girl with the brushes and coal scuttles around her, extinguishing the flames. I made my way to Heathcliff, to Wuthering Heights. I couldn't remove the chain of the garden gate, so I jumped over and knocked on the door to be admitted in, but no one opened it. "You wretched!" I shouted. "You deserve isolation for your inhospitality. I don't care, I will get in." Joseph projected his head from the window. "Hey, go round by the end of the barn if you want to speak to the master," he said. "There's nobody but the missus, and I shall not open it." It began to snow thickly when a young man came and took me inside the apartment where I had visited before. There the missus was sitting with a disagreeable look in her eyes and regardless manner. She was a slender, little-faced girl, apparently at the end of her teenage years. If her eyes had expressed good emotions, they would have been charming. What they showed was desperation and scorn. "Sit down," said the young man. "He'll be in soon." He was looking down on me as if there was hospitality between us. I could not understand if he's a servant or not. His dress and speech were rude, his hair seemed unclean, and his hands were like those of the workers. "I came according to promise, sir," I said upon the entrance of Heathcliff. "It's risky to walk in this snowstorm. People often miss their road on such evenings." "Maybe I can get one of your lads as a guide for tonight?" "No, you could not," was the answer, and then he demanded the young lady to make the tea. "Is he to have any?" she asked. "Get it ready, will you?" He said it in such a brutal tone that it revealed the bad nature in him. On the table I tried to dispel the tense atmosphere by praising the happy life of Mr. Heathcliff and the charming lady, Mrs. Heathcliff. This is in fact what I assumed. He informed me that his wife had died and that lady was his daughter-in-law. "Ah, I see. It's you who have the chance of possessing this beautiful lady," said I, turning to the young man. However, my second false remark was worse. Actually, neither of these men were the husband of the lady. Her mate, Mr. Heathcliff's son, was dead, and the young man, who is called Hareton Earnshaw, apparently was not Heathcliff's son. After finishing the meal, I approached the window and saw the windy, snowy, dark night. I said that I couldn't go home without a guide, but it irritated me very much when they prepared a dozen of sheep and the dogs as a guide for me. Meanwhile, just as Joseph brought the dogs, Mrs. Heathcliff was burning a bundle of matches which had fallen from the chimney-piece. "I wonder how you can busy yourself with that idleness, but it's no use talking. You'll never give up your bad habits and go right to the devil like your mother," he said to her. "You old hypocrite," she replied. "Do not provoke me, otherwise I'll show you how I progressed in black art. Be off, or I'll hurt you seriously." The little witch put a mock look into her beautiful eyes, and Joseph, scared to death, hurried out shouting "wicked" as he went. After the dialogue between the two, I asked Mrs. Heathcliff to tell me my way home, or else to persuade Mr. Heathcliff to give me a guide. She said that there were no boys at the farm to be my guide. "Then I am compelled to stay," I said. "I don't keep accommodations for visitors," came the voice of Heathcliff. "I can sleep on a chair in this room," I said. "No, a stranger is a stranger. I do not permit anyone in my place while I'm off," he said unmannerly. This was an insult, and I had no patience. With an expression of disgust, I ran through the door, but I couldn't see the way of exit because of the darkness. While I was running, I heard the young man's voice saying that he could guide me. They were arguing about it. Anyway, I saw a lantern just beside Joseph and took it, promising that I would send it in the morning. "Master, he's stealing the lantern! Hey, dog, hold him!" he shouted. The two monsters flew at my throat, and I was lying on the floor with the dogs over me. My nose was bleeding. It was Zillah, the housewife, who took me inside and cured it. I was so sick and dizzy that Zillah led me to bed. Chapter 3. The Night. While we were going to the room, we hid the candle and did not make any noise because Zillah said that Heathcliff would not let anybody stay in this room willingly. She didn't know the reason. When I looked inside the room, I saw an old-fashioned couch, a large oak case, and a closet serving as a table when enclosed. There were some books in one corner. They were covered with the names Catherine Earnshaw, the other Catherine Heathcliff, or else Catherine Linton. I checked out the books in the library and noticed that on all of them this Catherine name was written. Finally, I found her diary, and with curiosity in me, started to read it. I wish my father were back again. Hindley's treatment toward Heathcliff is horrible. It was a rainy day, so he couldn't go to church. Hindley and his wife were sitting before the fire. Heathcliff and I were commanded to take our prayer books. The service lasted long. We sheltered behind the curtain and made ourselves comfortable, but just at that moment, Joseph came and yelled, "The master has just been buried, and Sabbath is not over. Shame on you, bad children." Upon this speech, we kicked our books into the dog kennel. Hindley rushed from his seat, threw us into the back kitchen. Another sentence was beginning as, I cried a lot. Poor Heathcliff. Hindley won't let him eat or sit with us from now on. We even won't play together. He dares to blame our father for treating him too tolerantly. I was about to fall in asleep when I saw the title 70 times 7 and the first of the 71st, a discourse delivered by Jabez Branderham in the chapel of Gimmerden Sow. In my dream, I was journeying to hear the preaching of this famous Jabez Branderham, with Joseph accompanying me. We came to the chapel, but what a sermon it was! At last I was out of my tempers, and shouted to the other fellows, "Drag him down! Crush him to pieces! You are the man! Brethren, execute upon him the judgment written." Upon his words, the whole assembly rushed around me. I had no weapon to defend myself. In the end, to my relief, I woke up. I tried to sleep again. What I remembered was the sound of the wind and snow. It was so disturbing and terrifying that I rose to close the window. Just as doing this, I came across a girl standing out of the window and saying, "Let me in, let me in." "Who are you?" I asked. "Catherine Linton. I came home. I had lost my way on the moor." However, I was very frightened and said that I would never let her in, even if she begged me for 20 years. 20 years! I've been homeless for 20 years, she said, striving for opening the window. With a fright, I screamed. Then I realized that it was not an imaginary yell. The door opened, and Heathcliff entered. "Oh, Mr. Lockwood, you shouldn't have been in this room. Who took you here?" "Your servant Zillah, sir. This room is haunted. It's full of ghosts. You are right to keep it shut," I replied. "Your ancestors Jabez Branderham and Catherine Linton, or Earnshaw, whose name I read from the window ledge. I felt that I had to hide my knowledge about Catherine's diary, so I didn't mention it. Didn't leave me at ease all night." "How dare you speak to me in this way in my own house?" he yelled with rage. He was apparently affected by my words. While I was speaking, he sheltered himself behind the bed. I took pity on him. There was something causing a grief in him. I said that I would walk in the yard till the daylight and then go home. "Take the candle. I'll join you in 2 minutes, but do not go to the yard. The dogs are wandering around. Beware," he said. I heard his crying and talking to Catherine while I was standing in the corridor, trying to decide which way I should follow. Feeling sorry for him, I went to the back kitchen and sat on a bench. Grimalkin, the grey cat, accompanied me. Then Joseph came and sat by me, but somehow he ignored me and said nothing to me. He just smoked his pipe and departed. Then came Hareton Earnshaw also, without any salutation at all. Following him, I went into the house. Heathcliff was scolding Zillah. Then he turned to his daughter-in-law and scolded her too. As I didn't want to witness their quarrel any more, I turned down their invitation for breakfast. My landlord offered to come with me to the Thrushcross Park. He knew the roads well and warned me against the swells and falls. Many pits were filled to a level. Rises and depressions were not noticeable because of the snow. I made the rest of the way home by myself. It lasted longer than usual from Wuthering Heights due to the weather conditions. Everybody at home worried about me for my absence last night. After requesting for them to be calm and quiet, I went upstairs and put on dry clothes. I began to study with a cup of coffee. Chapter 4. The Family History. I got bored being alone all day long, so when Mrs. Dean came to my chamber to bring my supper, I asked her company for a while. To my luck, she was a talkative woman, and we began to chat about the past of both Thrushcross Grange and Wuthering Heights. She said that she had been living here for 18 years and became the housekeeper after her mistress. Mrs. Linton it was. Death. My curiosity grew bigger and bigger about all those people I had met in Wuthering Heights, especially about Mr. Heathcliff. Without any delay, I inquired, "Why did he prefer living in Wuthering Heights? This residence is superior to it. Is he in need of money?" I asked. "Oh, he's rich, sir. However, he's ready to get the money any tenant will pay. I can't understand his greediness, in spite of his loneliness in this world. He has no one. His son is dead. Maybe you know it." "Yes, I know," I replied. "That Mrs. Heathcliff, his son's widow, and the young man, Hareton Earnshaw, Where did they come from? The Linton family used to own Thrushcross Grange, and Catherine Linton, which is Mrs. Heathcliff's maiden name, is their daughter. I nursed her. Hareton is Mrs. Linton's nephew. In other words, he's Miss Cathy's cousin. The Earnshaws are old family, and Hareton is the last member of them. They used to live in Wuthering Heights, she explained. How about Heathcliff? He seems rather rough. Do you know anything about him? I wondered. I don't have any idea about his birthplace or parents. I don't know how he managed to make such a lot of money either. Yet I know how he cheated the unlucky lad, Hareton, she replied. Well, Mrs. Dean, I said, I'd be glad if you stayed and told me the whole story that you know. I don't feel like going to bed. Let's chat an hour. She accepted my invitation willingly. Apparently, she was pleased to find me friendly. I used to live at Wuthering Heights before settling here, she began, waiting no more to narrate, because my mother was working in Earnshaw's house. I would play with the children or do anything that was ordered of me. One day, the old master, Mr. Earnshaw, said that he'd be out of town for some day for business, and asked his children what they wanted from there. Cathy, who is Mrs. Heathcliff's mother, they have the same name, was 6, and Hindley was 14, the same age as me at that time. 3 days later, he came up with a boy who had a dirty appearance and black hair. The master had found him in the streets of Liverpool. As the boy was homeless and starving, the best thing was to take him home with him. However, neither the mistress nor the children were content with this decision. They didn't want the boy in their room. A few days later, the boy was named Heathcliff. In time, Cathy and he started to get on well, but Hindley and I still hated him. Maltreatment of Hindley toward him made the master outraged. It seemed as if he loved Heathcliff much more than his own son. After a while, Mrs. Earnshaw died, and Heathcliff caught a fatal illness. I looked after him during that time and discovered that he was a very patient child. Unlike Cathy and Hindley, he never complained. I began to like him. He was not disrespectful to the master, but he knew well to take advantage of his love and compassion for him. One day, Mr. Earnshaw brought 2 horses with him. Heathcliff chose the better one for him. When the horse became weak, he told Hindley that they must have exchanged the horses. "I'll tell your father that you've beaten me all week if you don't exchange," he threatened. Upon his words, Hindley threw him the iron weight in the stable. Just as Heathcliff was going to tell the matter to the old master, Hindley yelled, "Take the horse, you gypsy! I hope you fall and break your neck!" In the end, I persuaded Heathcliff to put the blame of his bruises on the horse. I thought he was not a revengeful child, but I was totally mistaken. Meanwhile, the master was getting worse day by day. He was losing his authority in the house and over the children. He couldn't stand their jokes and was often in a bad temper. When it became obvious that Hindley and Heathcliff wouldn't be able to stay in the same house peacefully, Hindley was sent to college. But it wasn't easy to have peace at all. Joseph, the servant, you saw him, was trying to get benefits from the master's illness and weakness. He was constantly giving sermons and making the master behave very strictly to the children. In addition to this, Cathy was a very difficult child to put up with. In spite of her naughtiness, she was very fond of both her father and Heathcliff. When the moment of death came for Mr. Earnshaw, she lay her head on her father's knees, and just beside her was Heathcliff. We all cried a lot after discovering that he had been dead. To my surprise, the children comforted each other with their good wishes for their father. I was very impressed and touched by the innocent and sincere talks of them. That scene was heaven itself, I thought. Chapter 5. The Growth of Hate in Heathcliff. When Mr. Hindley came for his father's funeral, he brought his wife with him. Her name was Frances, and she seemed quite pleased with the house. She looked admiringly at every object she saw. We were never informed about her past, but apparently Hindley loved her so much that he would do anything she wanted. In the beginning, she was very fond of Cathy. She was affectionate and kind toward her, as if they had been sisters. Unfortunately, it didn't last long. When she lost her former interest in her, Hindley became a tyrant again and recalled his hatred for Heathcliff. He told Joseph and me that we must spend our time and have our meal in the back kitchen, not inside the house. Heathcliff was also made to live with us in the kitchen. In other words, he was treated like a servant as well. With the order of Hindley, the tutor no longer instructed him. Cathy taught him what she had learnt. This would run and play on the moors all day. The stricter Hindley and Joseph, with his religious discourses, became the wilder and naughtier the children got. Moreover, Hindley completely neglected them. One day, they went out again and did not return home. Hindley commanded that nobody should let them in if they came back at night. Then everybody went to bed. After a while, I saw Heathcliff alone coming. Surely I let him in, but Miss Catherine was absent. We saw lights of Thrushcross Grange and wondered what the Lintons and their children, Isabella and Edgar, were doing. Did they receive bad treatment from their parents as we did? Thinking this, we climbed the window ledge and detected inside the house. Oh, Nellie, what a beautiful house it was! The children living in it must have had peace and the warmth of a tender family. But these stupid children were sitting sulking, he explained. But what about Cathy? I asked impatiently. Wait, I'm telling you, he replied. We decided to frighten them by making horrible noises. They heard us and called their parents. Just as we were trying to escape, Cathy fell down and had her foot seized by the dog. The family came out. When they recognized Cathy and noticed how her foot was bleeding, they took her in and decided that she should spend the night with them. But they found me quite unfit for their beautiful house and precious children, so they sent me. I got very angry with their manners and the words they used for me. If Cathy were unwilling to go with them, I'd get inside and take her. But she looked content. They lay her on the sofa, washed her foot, and combed her beautiful hair. They were watching her with admiration. She deserves it, doesn't she, Nellie? The following morning, Mr. Linton visited us, explained the matter, and gave some advice to the young master. Hindley didn't beat Heathcliff, but he forbade him to talk to Miss Cathy. Cathy stayed at Thrushcross Grange for 5 weeks, and when she came, she just looked like a lady. During her absence, Francis visited her properly and bought her nice dresses. Even Hindley was delighted to see her. "Oh, Cathy, how beautiful you are!" he exclaimed. We all met her at the door. Then she looked around for Heathcliff. "Heathcliff, you can come and greet her like the other servants," said Hindley. Cathy ran to him and kissed him. Then, looking at him, she burst out into laughter. "Why, Heathcliff, you look very black and dirty. It's funny," she said. "You needn't have touched me if you didn't want. I like to be dirty, and I'll be dirty," he answered and left. Cathy couldn't make out his bad temper, but she became very upset. It was Christmas, and the Lintons were invited for the night. It was requested by Mrs. Linton that her children might be kept apart from the wicked gypsy boy, which was Heathcliff. I made all preparations for dinner. Then Heathcliff came and said, "Nellie, dress me properly. I want to be good." I accepted joyfully, and while helping him dress, I told him Cathy had come to the kitchen to see him and how she cried and was upset because of his behavior. "You must talk to Cathy with sincere feelings and should not make her feel like a stranger. I'll arrange so that you'll be far more handsome than Edgar Linton is," I said. "But Nellie," he said, "whatever you do to me, I cannot have fair skin. I cannot behave as well as him, or be as rich as him." "Look into the mirror, boy. Don't you see you're handsome?" I encouraged. "And what is important is to have a good heart. Don't be ashamed of yourself. Maybe you're from a noble family, son of an Indian queen, for instance, and was brought to England by some wicked English sailors. Who knows?" So the boy got pleased with my words and went downstairs to meet the guests. However, Hindley was annoyed by his clean and good-looking appearance. He commanded Heathcliff to go to his room until dinner was over. My attempt to defend him made Hindley angrier. "You won't come downstairs till dark. Did you comb your hair? I get hold of them and pull them a bit longer, you gypsy," he shouted. "Yes, they seem too long. Don't they make headaches?" Edgar Linton asked. It made Heathcliff so furious that he threw the hot applesauce at him. Mr. Earnshaw must have beaten him in his chamber, because when he returned, he was breathless. Edgar's nose and mouth were bleeding, and his sister Isabella was weeping. Cathy was shocked at the incident, but in the end she scolded Edgar. "You shouldn't have spoken to him. He'll be whipped because of you, and I hate this," she said, and then returned to Isabella. "Don't cry. Are you killed? Are you hurt? No. Then be quiet." Then they all took their seats at the dinner table. I observed that Cathy was pretending to seem indifferent, but she was very upset. In the evening, everybody started to dance with the arrival of the Gimmerton band, so it was very crowded inside. It was an opportunity for Cathy to go to Heathcliff's chamber. They came to the kitchen together, and Heathcliff ate something. After sitting by himself silently for a while, he confessed that he was making a plan to take revenge on Hindley one day in the future. Suddenly, Mrs. Dean interrupted her story. "Oh, Mr. Lockwood," she said, "I really kept it long and prevented you from sleeping. I'm sorry." "No, Mrs. Dean, please go on without skipping any part. I like it, and I don't feel like sleeping yet. You must finish the story in the same style," I replied. "All right then," she continued. "I'll pass to the summer of 1778, nearly 23 years ago." Chapter 6. The Changes at Wuthering Heights. On a fine June day that summer, little Earnshaw was born. What a beauty it was! It caused those looking at it to be cheerful and happy. But there was a problem. The doctor said that Frances caught a malady and would not live long. Although she was expected to die before winter, Dr. Kenneth gave medicine to her regularly because Hindley didn't want to accept this fact and strongly believed in her recovery. At last she died within a week. Poor Hindley! He wouldn't bear this loss. I was the only one who would nurse and feed the baby Hareton. Hindley trusted me on that occasion, but he himself was in very bad and pitiful condition. After his wife's death, he never prayed. Instead, he swore to God and to all of us. He had a drinking habit. He was drunk almost every day. The other servants, except Joseph and me, couldn't bear any more and left. In time, we received no visitors other than Edgar Linton. Even Edgar avoided visiting while Hindley was at home. Heathcliff was 16 that year. He lost interest in seeking knowledge as he was deprived of education after old Mr. Earnshaw's death. Furthermore, he was becoming introverted day by day. His mere companion was Cathy. They often met in the moors after Heathcliff's labor was over. However, Cathy didn't take their friendship into consideration anymore. She said that they did not share anything. "Ours is not company at all, because you know nothing and say nothing," she told him once, and this hurt Heathcliff very much. Miss Cathy was 15, and her noticeable beauty made her rather arrogant. She kept her company with the Lintons, and they often met. However, she raised up two different characters in herself. Although she was a savage at home, she displayed her polite and ladylike manners toward the Lintons. They never knew her rough side, but very soon Edgar witnessed her aggressiveness and rudeness. One day, when he came, I was in the room too, tidying it owing to Hindley's directions. My presence annoyed her, and in order to make me leave the room, she pinched me. We quarreled a bit. Little Hareton was afraid and cried, saying, "Wicked Aunt Cathy." This made her furious, and she began to shake the boy. Edgar tried to calm her down, but just at that moment her hand blew up on his ear. He was shocked and attempted to leave the house, but he couldn't bear her cries, so he turned back. To my surprise, the incident did not affect them so much that they confessed their love to each other. With the arrival of Hindley, they had to quit, and Edgar left. When I heard Hindley's coming, I rushed to hide little Hareton so that he couldn't do any harm to the boy. However, he noticed my attempts and insisted that he wanted to hug and kiss the boy. Hareton was unwilling to do it because he was afraid of his father's constant curses and increasing aggressive manners. At the end of this struggle, Hindley grasped the boy and addressed himself to upstairs. He reached the top of the stairs, and all of a sudden the child slipped from his arms and fell. Fortunately, Heathcliff was downstairs and held him. We were all full of horror. "Do not meddle with the child," I cried. "He hates you. Everybody hates you. You spoiled a family. How dare you try to kill a boy who has the same blood as you?" "It's a punishment for his maker," he said, grinning. "Now be out of my reach. You too, Heathcliff." After this unfortunate experience, Miss Cathy came to my chamber. "Oh, Nellie, I've made a decision today, but I'm very unhappy," she said. "Edgar asked me to marry him, and I said yes. What is your opinion?" "You accepted him. What's the meaning of asking now?" I objected. Then I asked, "Do you love him?" "Of course I do," she replied. "Why do you love him, Miss Cathy?" I insisted. "Because he's handsome, young, and pleasant to be with." "Bad," I commented. "And because he loves me. Worse. And he'll be rich and I'll be the greatest woman of the neighborhood." "Oh, the worst of all," I exclaimed. "But anyway," I continued, "both Hindley and the Lintons shall be content with the decision. What's wrong then?" "I feel something is wrong. Hindley reduced Heathcliff to a servant. If I married him, I'd humiliate myself," she said. Just at that moment, I heard Heathcliff's going out of the room quietly. Apparently, he listened to our whole conversation. But as he left, he missed Cathy's last words about him, which were that she loved him very much. "And our souls are the same, Nellie," she added. She never wanted to be separate from him, even when she married Edgar. What she aimed afterwards was to rescue him from Hindley's power. With the entrance of Joseph, we finished our talk and looked for Heathcliff, but could not find him. Then I whispered to Cathy that he had heard the most part of our conversation. She also went out to call him, but couldn't find him either. All night long, Cathy waited for him. It was rainy and stormy outside, and she got wet. In spite of my constant insistence, she didn't change her clothes. She didn't go to her chamber either. She felt responsible for his loss and became dangerously ill. The doctor said that we should take care. She would not throw herself downstairs or out of the window. The Lintons offered to look after her, but after a while, both Mr. and Mrs. Linton died of fever. Miss Cathy considered herself as our mistress when she returned from the Lintons. She couldn't stand any quarrel or conflict. 3 years after the Lintons' death, she married Edgar. She was Mrs. Linton now. Poor Edgar was in love with her and believed himself the happiest man on earth that day. I moved from Wuthering Heights to Thrushcross Grange with Cathy too. I was not willing, but Hindley ordered so. Hareton was 5 that year. I kissed him goodbye, and since then we've been strangers. I think he doesn't even remember me now. Mrs. Dean finished her story at this part. We both went to our beds because it was already 1:30. Chapter 7. The Conflicts. Mr. Lockwood's narration. "Oh, how unlucky I am! I am very sick. Dr. Kenneth said that I shouldn't go out till spring." Then came Mrs. Dean, and I asked her to finish her story during my boring days. I really wonder what happened to Heathcliff. She was delighted with my request, and began her narration willingly. Mrs. Dean's narration. On the first day at Thrushcross Grange, everything was fine. Cathy and Edgar got on very well. Furthermore, Isabella and Cathy were acting like sisters. The 3 of them were caring for each other very much. At least it seemed so. However, all ended up with the reappearance of Heathcliff. One day, while I was working in the garden, he found me. I was shocked. He looked like a real gentleman. Without speaking much, he asked me to tell Cathy that someone wanted to see her. To see Heathcliff 3 years later, and almost all of a sudden, made Cathy very excited. Mr. Linton accepted him in their apartment, as he couldn't bear Cathy's insistence. She was looking at Heathcliff so admiringly that it was impossible for Edgar not to notice it. He was irritated by the changes in Heathcliff's physical appearance and her wife's fondness of him, but he never lost his temper or kindness in order not to upset Cathy. Heathcliff did not stay long that night. That day in the afternoon, Heathcliff called on Wuthering Heights first in order to find me and get information about Cathy. Then Joseph told him I moved to Thrushcross Grange with her too. He took him into the house. At that moment, Hindley was playing cards with some men. Heathcliff joined too, and Hindley lost some money to him. But he noticed that he had plenty of money, and offered him to come in the evening too. He would pay for his accommodation in Wuthering Heights. Cathy repaired Edgar's broken heart because the next morning they were on good terms again. He even let her go to Wuthering Heights with Isabella to see Heathcliff. Also, Heathcliff made use of Mr. Linton's patience and toleration. He visited the Grange constantly. He somehow seemed to figure his limitation. Another unexpected thing happened, and Isabella fell in love with Heathcliff. She rejected to eat and got weaker day by day. When Cathy offered her to see Dr. Kenneth in the end, she confessed it was Cathy herself who made her unhappy. She was offended by Cathy's behavior to her when they were with Heathcliff. "In the moors you sent me away while you both conversed," she sobbed, "because you knew I liked to be there with you." "It's funny," laughed Cathy. "I didn't think our conversation interested you, but I can repeat our talk word by word if you wish. What I mind is Mr. Heathcliff himself, not your conversation," she cried. "You don't want anyone to be loved except yourself." "I can't believe this stupidity," exclaimed Catherine. "How can you admire such a man? He is wild, doesn't have the notion of nobility, doesn't have education either. He's not a kind of man who would turn out to be polite and caring later. He's pitiless. I know him well, and that's all I can say. But if you still want him, I can let you fall into his trap." I mentioned about his cruelty, too. We had no idea how he had been living, or he had made plenty of money before he turned back here. Since he came and settled in Wuthering Heights, Hindley has been getting worse because of drinking and losing money to Heathcliff. Apparently, he was abusing Hindley and taking his revenge. When I said this, Isabella got on her feet and yelled, "You're in union with her, Nellie, and you, Catherine, you're a poisonous friend and worse than an enemy." "Oh, you think I said all of these facts because I am wicked and selfish?" said Catherine. "Then go and try for yourself." The following day, Mr. Heathcliff, I began to call him Mr., came in the absence of Mr. Linton. When Catherine saw his entering, she began to talk joyfully in a way that revealed Isabella's love for him. Upon her mocking speech, Isabella decided to leave the room, but Catherine grasped her. The poor lady was becoming red and white in front of Heathcliff. In the end, she used her sharp nails and managed to free herself and went out of the room. Thinking that Isabella would have her brother's property, Heathcliff seemed to consider making use of her love for him. This is what I guess. But it's apparent from his later behaviors that he would take his revenge on those who had hurt him in his boyhood. From that moment on, I decided to watch his movements. One day, I decided to go to Wuthering Heights to see Hindley. When I came nearer to the house, I saw little Hareton in the garden, but it's been 10 months since I left there, and the boy didn't recognize me. He was swearing and cursing in his every sentence. He said it was Heathcliff who taught him to swear, especially to his father. Nobody taught the boy to read and write. I asked him to call his father, but to my surprise, it was not Hindley, but Heathcliff that the boy called. I turned my back and went out. I had already started to hate Heathcliff. The next time he came to the Grange, I saw him approaching Isabella and embracing her. "Heathcliff, what are you doing?" objected Catherine. "Do you want to be on bad terms with Linton? Do you like her? Tell the truth." "I have a right to kiss her," he said, "and you're not my wife. Don't be jealous of me. Do you think I'll remain silent without exacting revenge? But don't worry, it's not you that I'll take revenge on. By the way, thank you for not hiding Isabella's love for me." While they were conversing, Mr. Linton came, and was informed by me about the details of their talk. He rushed into the kitchen and made quite a polite speech, requesting for Heathcliff's quick departure. Heathcliff made fun of his manner, saying, "Cathy, look at the man that you preferred to me. Is he crying or going to faint from fear?" Catherine also triggered the fight between the two men by acting thoughtlessly. In the end, Edgar went out to take his gun and some men to assist him. Heathcliff noticed the danger and ran away. After this incident, Mrs. Linton went to her room and asked me to tell Mr. Linton she was dangerously ill. In fact, it was a plan of hers to be bad-tempered and act as ill when she saw Edgar so that he had to tolerate her, and in order not to upset her, he would pretend to forget the incident. As I didn't want to be part of this plan and frighten the master, I didn't tell him anything. However, I should have done what the mistress asked me to do, because all she said turned out to be true. She closed herself in her chamber and rejected to take me in or eat anything. At last she called me as she ran out of clean water. Then she ate something. She asked what Edgar was doing. He busies himself with his books. He's fine, was my reply. What? She exclaimed. I'm dying here, and he sits in the library and reads a book? Oh, he doesn't love me anymore. The fact is that Mr. Linton didn't even know her disorder. She couldn't bear the indifference of her husband and began to display mad actions such as tearing the pillow with her teeth. Suddenly I remembered Dr. Kenneth's former warning about which we shouldn't tease her because of her illness. She saw hallucinations all night. Then she mentioned about her childhood with Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. Oh, I miss those days very much, Nellie, she said. If only I hadn't left Wuthering Heights and hadn't married Linton. If only I could be that little girl again, running on the moors freely. It's as if I hadn't lived after my father died, and Hindley separated Heathcliff from me. She was constantly trying to open the window and breathe the wind which helped her imagine herself on the moors, and in those days. Just as I was struggling with her insanity, Mr. Linton came in. It didn't take him long to notice her illness. He went beside her, but the mistress said she didn't want him any more. Oh my God, am I nothing to you? Was the reaction of my master. He was full of horror and astonishment. Meanwhile, I rushed out to find Dr. Kenneth. While going on my way, I saw Isabella's dog, Fanny, was hung with a handkerchief by a hook on the wall. I rescued the dog, but wondered who did this merciless thing. When I told Catherine's situation to the doctor, he commented that something serious must have been happening at home. A lady like Catherine does not easily fall ill, he added. He asked about Mr. Linton and Heathcliff. Then he said that Heathcliff and Isabella were seen together in the garden the night before. Then we went into Catherine's chamber together, and he examined her. He said we should keep her in perfect silence and peace. All night long we didn't move anywhere, but looked after her. Finally, the bad news came. Isabella had run away with Heathcliff the night before. Mr. Linton didn't want us to do anything about the situation. It's her choice, was the only comment he made. Chapter 8. Farewell. 2 months later, Mrs. Linton was able to go out of her chamber and breathe the spring air coming from the hills with the smell of flowers. Mr. Linton was very affectionate to her, and sitting beside her, he watched her every single movement. He was hopeful about her health. However, Catherine herself believed that death was close to her. Meanwhile, I received a letter from Isabella, and I still keep it. Let me read it. Dear Nellie, I heard about Catherine's illness, but you know I can't write to her. I guess Edgar is still angry with me, and won't answer my letter, so I decided to write to you. Oh, Nellie, I haven't been treated well since the first moment we arrived at Wuthering Heights. How did you manage to bear the people living in here? Furthermore, I really wonder, is Heathcliff mad or a devil? He accused Edgar of Catherine's illness, and said that I would be the one who suffered from his cruelty until he got a hold of Edgar. How could I marry such a man? I'm so stupid. None of the other members of the house love me. Hareton swore at me. Joseph constantly scolded me. The house was not like you had left it. There weren't any servants to take me to my chamber other than Joseph, who was very rude and disrespectful to me. Hindley was apparently mad. He warned me that we should lock our chamber's doors because he would try it every night in the hope of killing Heathcliff if he found it unlocked. Then he showed me a pistol. I'm very unhappy, Nellie. I missed you all and my home so much. I wish I could see Edgar. How I need him. Nellie, please come instead of writing an answer, and bring something from Edgar. When I told the master about his sister's letter, his answer was, We are separate forever, and communication between Heathcliff's family and us is impossible. He also rejected to write even a small note to her. Poor Isabella was very disappointed by her brother's attitude. She took her seat, and did not join the conversation between Mr. Heathcliff and me for a while. He asked Catherine's situation. I informed him, adding that I hoped he would not visit her again. I said her appearance and character had changed, her mental health was weaker, and it was Mr. Linton who took care of her. Nellie, is it possible that he loves Cathy more than I do? He interrupted. And do you think that she is happy without me? I think every moment she looks at him, she thinks of me. He doesn't have a capacity to give all his love to her. He doesn't have a deep heart either. How can she love such a man? Then he said he was very cruel to Isabella and didn't love her. According to him, she was silly and deserved such bad treatment. Even when I hung her dog, she didn't say anything, he added, then continued. Anyway, Nellie, what I want from you is to arrange an interview with Catherine. I have to see her, and I will. If you help me, we can make it without Edgar's knowledge. I refused to betray my master, but at the end, I had to accept it, and took a letter to her from him. I could give it 3 days later on Sunday, when everybody went to church. Throughout these days, Heathcliff waited in the garden. It was a nice spring day, so I left the doors open. Besides, it was a sign for Heathcliff to come in. As soon as he entered the room, he rushed to Catherine, kissed and caressed her. He noticed that she was on the verge of death. I wish I could caress you till we both died, she said, but you and Edgar have broken my heart. How long will you live after I died? Will you forget me? Maybe you'll love others and have children, and just remember me as a past memory. Don't torment me this way while you're dying, he cried. You are my soul. How can one forget his soul? Come here, my darling, she said softly. You've never hurt me, but why don't you come? Oh, you see, Nellie, he still tortures me. This is not my Heathcliff. I keep mine in my heart yet. He's in my soul. He turned to her, looking desperately, and knelt down in front of her. They caressed and kissed each other. Why did you leave me and betray your own heart, Cathy? He asked. You loved me, but married this man. It was you that broke your own heart and mine. But I love my murderer. At this moment, I heard Mr. Linton coming upstairs and told Heathcliff to hurry. However, Cathy didn't want him to leave her. Look, I'm dying, she cried. He can't harm us any more. Linton came in, but seeing that Catherine fainted, he didn't say anything to Heathcliff. Then Heathcliff left, telling me to inform him about her in the morning. He would wait in the garden all night long. Catherine was unconscious about the people around her. She knew nobody. She gave birth to a girl and then died. Edgar was mournful and looked like a dead the following day. Leaving him on his own, I went to see Heathcliff. He was sitting under a tree and guessed that she was dead. He looked terrible. He asked how she died and if she ever called his name before dying. She died quietly, like falling in a sleep, I replied. However, she recognized no one. Oh, Catherine, do not leave me. Haunt me. Always be with me, he cried wildly. Then he started to hit his head against the tree till it smeared with blood. Edgar spent his days beside Catherine's coffin till her funeral. Heathcliff was in the garden all those days. Hindley was expected to the funeral, but he couldn't come, as he was drunk again. Isabella was not invited. Chapter 9. A Peaceful Period. A few days after the funeral, it was chilly and snowy. My master didn't go out of his room. I was sitting in the living room with the little baby on my knees when I heard someone entering, not so quietly. It was Mrs. Heathcliff. She was cold and out of breath. She had run all the way from Wuthering Heights to the Grange with thin clothes on her. I don't know how many times I had fallen on the way, Nellie, she said. Oh, my body hurts, but don't panic. Just give me dry clothes and tell the servants to arrange a carriage in order to take me to Gimmerton. She looked exhausted, and there were bruises on her face and a cut under one ear. After I made a package and put some clothes of hers in it, she began to narrate what had made her run away from Wuthering Heights. I didn't come here to cause Edgar trouble. I just had to shelter here, and I'll leave as fast as I can. I'd like to stay here in my own house, help Edgar get better, and look after the baby. However, Heathcliff doesn't make us live in peace if I settle in here again. How could I love such a man? He's a monster. I was forced to run away because he began to apply murderous violence. He hasn't been sitting with us since Catherine's death. He spent the whole day out and came late at night. Mr. Earnshaw was going to attend the funeral, but he couldn't stop drinking. We both were sitting by the fire in silence. By the way, he's quieter and less angry as long as no one meddles with him. Suddenly, we heard of Heathcliff's returning. I'll keep him out for 5 minutes. You won't object, will you? He asked. It doesn't matter for me if you keep him out all night, I replied. He locked the front door, but what he intended was to kill him, and he wanted my assistance. Just as he was taking his gun and knife out of his jacket, I objected. "No, don't kill him. Just don't let him get inside." But he was determined. I ran to the window and shouted to Heathcliff, "You had better go somewhere else tonight. Mr. Earnshaw is going to shoot you if you try to get in." He swore at me and then ordered me to open the door. I said I would not cause a murder by letting him in. At last he managed to get in by breaking the window glass. Earnshaw's gun exploded but shot no one. His knife went into his own wrist. He fell with great pain. Heathcliff, the monster in other words, kicked him until he got tired of this violent action. After he became quite satisfied, he ordered Joseph to take and look after him. This morning, 3 of us were in the living room. I was talking to Hindley and asking how he was. "I wish I had the power to fight with him. Even he killed me. I would go to hell with joy," he murmured. "It's enough that he has murdered Catherine," I said aloud, in order to make Heathcliff hear me. "Everyone knows Catherine would have been alive if she hadn't known someone like Heathcliff." I saw him crying. "Get out of the room!" he yelled. "No, I can't," said I. "Hindley needs help, and I see Catherine's eyes in his own. If she had trusted and married you, undoubtedly she would have been just like me and detested you." Upon my last words, he threw a knife at me. It struck beneath my ear. Pulling it out, I started to run and arrived here at last. So Isabella finished her story and left with her dog Fanny. She never returned here, but kept in touch with Edgar. We learnt that she settled near London and had a son called Linton. Heathcliff heard of his son's name. "They want me to hate my son, don't they?" he said. "But I'll take him in when I want. They'll see." Unfortunately, he was right. 6 months after Catherine's death, we heard of Hindley's death. The night before his death, he closed the doors against Heathcliff and began to drink. When they got in the house in the morning, they found him dead. While alive, he couldn't pay his debts to Heathcliff and mortgaged the whole land in order to have cash and go on playing cards. In other words, Heathcliff was the new owner of the land and the master of the house. He rejected giving Hareton to Mr. Linton. Mr. Linton did not display an insisting attitude. He wasn't ambitious and passionate like Heathcliff. After her wife's death, he didn't want Catherine's ghost to haunt him. He spent most of his time at home, and in time he got used to his way of living. His daughter, little Cathy, was the main consolation to him. He took all responsibility. He enjoyed educating her. He was really a good father. They were very fond of each other. The girl took both her mother's and father's features. She was a beautiful girl with a mild and lively character. She didn't have excessive anger like her mother. Until the age of 13, she hadn't seen beyond the Grange. She wasn't aware of Wuthering Heights and its residents. As we hadn't had any communications with Heathcliff since she was born, she had a happy and peaceful childhood with her father and me. However, she began to wonder about the land beyond Wuthering Heights that year. Mr. Linton promised to let her go to these places when she got older. He didn't want his daughter to know Heathcliff and Hareton. One day, Mr. Linton received a letter from his sister. She was ill and wanted to see her brother for the last time. She was also going to leave little Linton to him. For this reason, he set off for London for 3 weeks. He told me to take care of Cathy and not to let her go out of the Grange. It was summer, and she liked wandering around either on foot or on horse. One day, she went out in the morning and did not appear at tea time. The farmer said he saw her on a horse galloping with the escort of 2 dogs. Then she was out of his sight. She must have gone along the way to Wuthering Heights, I thought. When I approached there, I saw one of the dogs lying in the garden of the house. I was right. She was sitting on a chair and talking joyfully with Hareton and the housekeeper. Hareton was 18, and he was watching her with great curiosity. At first she welcomed me merrily, but when I insisted that we should go, she jumped and ran around the room because she didn't know the reason for my hurry. At last I got tired of chasing her and said, "Miss Cathy, if you knew whose house this is, you would get out willingly." "It's your father's, isn't it?" she asked Hareton. "No," replied the boy, getting embarrassed. "It's your master's then," she said, and added, Bring my horse and dog." Hareton seemed irritated by her speech. Upon her words, the housekeeper said that he was not the master's son, but her cousin. This fact made her cry, and she wanted to go home. The boy offered her another dog in order to make peace with her, but she wanted hers to look at him with fear. Although he was more handsome than his father, Hindley, he looked like a servant, as he was made to work on a farm by Heathcliff. But it was apparent that Heathcliff didn't harm him physically, because the boy was fearless. Anyway, on our way back home, I warned Cathy not to say anything about that day to his father. I informed her Mr. Linton didn't like the residents of Wuthering Heights, and I might be dismissed if she said anything. Fortunately, she kept her word. Chapter 10. Young Linton. A few days later, we were informed about Isabella's death with Mr. Linton's letter. He also stated that he would turn back together with Linton, who was just 6 months younger than Cathy. She was very happy and excited about meeting her real cousin. We welcomed them at the garden gate. As soon as the carriage stopped, she caressed her father. But before she could look inside the carriage for Linton, Mr. Linton warned her. "Look, darling," he said softly. "You know Linton has just lost his mother, so he's not cheerful and strong. Don't force him to play games with you." She obeyed her father, but she was very impatient to see her cousin. He was a pale and thin boy, resembling the master very much. We tried a bit to cheer him up. After having his tea, he lied on the sofa. Cathy was sorry for him, and she had already felt fondness for him even before they met. She sat by her sad cousin, stroked his hair, and kissed his cheeks. Her compassion made the boy stop crying. He even put a smile on his face. We watched them. The master believed that both Cathy's company and our concern helped him gain his strength. Unfortunately, we lost our hope with sudden intrusion of Joseph at midnight. He was ordered to take the child by Heathcliff. As he was the child's own father, Mr. Linton could not object much. Very early in the morning, I woke the boy, saying that we were going to see his father, Mr. Heathcliff, and that he was going to spend some time with him. Mr. Linton said Cathy shouldn't know where I took Linton. We would tell her that his father came, so he had to leave us. Obeying this, without her knowledge, I prepared Linton for his new home, and we settled for Wuthering Heights. Linton was reluctant to go there and meet his father. He wanted to stay with his uncle. He didn't even know that he had a father because Isabella never mentioned about him. Along the way, I talked about Hareton and Heathcliff. I told him Mr. Linton and Cathy would visit him, and Hareton would show interesting places to him on the moors. So he started to wonder about his new family. But I was worried about the child's future in Heathcliff's hands. What kind of a life would such a weak boy lead with this pitiless man? "Oh, Nellie," greeted Heathcliff, "you have brought my property at last. Let me see him." He sat on the sofa and held the boy roughly in order to examine him. Linton was trembling. "Don't be afraid, boy. I'm not going to hurt you," he said. He was making fun of the boy's fear. "Do you know me? Has your mother ever mentioned me?" he asked. "No," replied Linton. "What a shame of your mother. Then I tell you, you are my son." "I hope you'll be kind to the boy," I interfered. "You know, he is all you have in the world." "Don't worry, Nellie. I want to show my kindness right now," said he, laughing. "Joseph, serve the boys breakfast. Anyway, Nellie, my son will be the owner of Thrushcross Grange, and I don't want him to die before it happens. And it will be my triumph. I think I could bear this boy just for this reason. Otherwise, I detest him, as he reminds me of not good things. But I'll take care of him. He has his own room and a tutor who is going to teach him what he wants to learn. Besides, Hareton will serve him too. Although this little thing doesn't deserve any of this, I will try to make him superior." After their introduction, I decided to leave quietly. But as soon as I closed the door behind me, I heard Linton crying, "Don't go! I don't want to stay here!" Chapter 11. The Letters. It was hard to console Cathy after her cousin's departure. When I came across the housekeeper of Wuthering Heights, I learnt about Linton. "He's a very delicate boy. To leave the window open is sufficient to make him ill, even in the middle of summer. If he weren't his son, The master would put him out of doors, I'm sure, she said. Mr. Linton wondered about him too, so I kept getting information about him from that woman. But then she left Wuthering Heights, and we heard nothing about Linton afterwards till we saw him. I think the new housekeeper still lives there. On the day Cathy became 16, the master spent his day on his own. As it was also the day of his wife's death, he visited her grave and stayed there till midnight. He let Cathy wander on the moors as long as we wouldn't go so far and return in an hour. So she took me to a hill which was very near to Wuthering Heights, in order to observe the nests of the birds. While we were getting closer to the place, I saw Heathcliff appearing. He asked what she was doing in his land. I just wanted to see the birds' eggs, she replied. Father said there are many of them here, but I wouldn't take any. Who's your father? He asked, grinning, although he knew the answer. Mr. Linton of Thrushcross Grange. And who are you? Is he your son? She asked, pointing to Hareton. No, he's not, but I have one, he added. And you know him. Why don't you come to see him? Besides, you'll have a rest. I tried to prevent her from accepting his offer, but she had already reached the gate of the farm. My design is clear, said Heathcliff to me while we were following her behind. I want Linton and her to marry. You know Linton is not a healthy boy. If he died while they were married, the property of Thrushcross Grange would not go to her, but to me. The two cousins didn't recognize each other at first. Linton grew taller and was brighter than I remembered. Oh, Linton, said Cathy at last, what a surprise it is to see you. She kissed him. She became a very beautiful girl with a lively character. Then she turned to Heathcliff. And you're my uncle then, she said. Why don't you visit us with Linton? I used to go there, answered he, but we had a quarrel with Mr. Linton in the past. According to him, I shouldn't marry his sister, as I was poor. Our marriage hurt his pride. You may come here to see your cousin, but don't mention your visits to your father. At first, Linton didn't want to go out, so Hareton accompanied Cathy. He was raised by Heathcliff just like a servant, but he was not a foolish boy. While he was showing the landscape to her, I caught her eyes filled with admiration for him. He reminds me of my own youth. I know what he suffers, said Heathcliff while observing them. There's this difference between Linton and him. I tried to create the best from what Linton has, although he's very poor in character. Hareton is a very clever boy, but lack of education causes him to feel inferior. Just at that moment, Linton and Cathy were making fun of him as he couldn't read the writing over the door. I began to dislike Linton. The next morning, she told Mr. Linton where we went the day before, and asked what their quarrel was about. He is a wicked man who does harm to those he hates, he explained, and as he dislikes me, I thought he would detest you and hurt you. Then he made a brief explanation of the things that happened in the past. Cutting it short, he wanted her not to go there any more. After a while, I observed that she was hiding something in her drawer. At night, when everyone went to bed, I tried one of the keys I had in order to unlock the drawer. I took the papers inside with me to my chamber and locked the drawer again. To my surprise, I found out that they were love letters between Linton and her. They were written in an emotional tone, but they were childish and silly at the same time. The following morning, I noticed that they had been sending letters to each other with the help of a boy who was carrying milk cans. She must have understood that I had her letters, because she called me to her room. Oh, you've got them, Nellie. Give them to me, she begged. Please don't tell my father. I promise I won't write any more. After quarreling on that subject, I persuaded her to burn all of them. She cried all night for Linton, mostly rather than herself. I said nothing to the master about it. In the morning, I gave the little boy a note to take to Linton, which wrote on it, Miss Linton will not receive any letters from Master Linton Heathcliff, so he is requested to send no more. We left summer behind. It was generally cold and windy. As the master caught a bad cold due to this chilling weather, he spent the whole winter indoors. Cathy lost her cheerfulness. She was usually sad and bored. Mr. Linton advised her to go out and walk more often. Obeying his advice, we wandered around, but Cathy was very miserable and started to cry. The idea of losing her father and me frightened her. I said she should think of good things and be thankful to God that nothing worse happened. We approached a door that opened to land. There was a high wall beside it. Kathy cheered up a little bit after our talk and decided to climb to the tree next to that door in order to pick up some fruit. However, her hat fell off to the other side of the door. Just as I was going home to take some keys and try the door, we saw Heathcliff. "Oh, Miss Linton, you were writing to Linton 2 or 3 months ago, weren't you?" he asked, then continued with an evil smile on his face. "I think you got bored after a while and stopped writing. Well, but you ruined him so much that he's dying." Sadness and disappointment is fastening his illness. It's nothing but you who can be his medicine. Kathy was confused and listening to him with her wide-opened eyes. "I'm serious, Nellie. He's very bad," he added. "I won't be here all this week, so you can visit him with the permission of Mr. Linton. Miss Kathy, I think he'll let you see your cousin and comfort him in this situation, because he needs you. He needs compassion and love." Kathy thought over Heathcliff's speech all night. I said that he was lying and warned her against being deceived by him. "You may be right, Nellie, but I should see him in order to feel relieved," she said, "and I must explain why I don't write to him." The following day, I accompanied her to Wuthering Heights. Chapter 12. Kathy's Visits. When we arrived at Wuthering Heights, we found only Joseph and Linton at home. Linton was sitting by the fire and complaining about the heat inside. Then he saw us enter and asked Kathy to shut the door. He was coughing constantly and looked very ill. "Why didn't you come before instead of writing? Writing those long letters tired me very much," he said. "Because I don't like Mr. Heathcliff," she answered. "Are you pleased to see me?" "Yes, I am. But when you stopped both writing and visiting, Father said that you hated me." "He is on the moors for hunting now," he added quickly, "so you can spend some time with me, will you? Please." "Of course," she replied. "I wish you were my brother." She stroked his hair. "So that you could live with us at the Grange." "Father said you would love me more if we got married," he said cheerfully. "I'd not prefer it because people sometimes hate their wives, but not their sisters or brothers," she said. When the boy insisted that she was wrong, she gave the instance of his own mother and father. Linton was irritated by her example and said, "Well, do you know that your mother hated your father and that she loved mine?" "You are lying! I hate you!" she cried. He went on teasing her with such words. Finally, she pushed his chair with anger, and he fell. He immediately started to cough, which lasted very long. "You cruel thing," said he at last. "Hareton never hits me." "I'm sorry, Linton, but I couldn't guess you would fall," she replied. He didn't speak to her for a while. Even when she asked if he wanted her to go, he remained silent. Just as we were about to leave, he called us. He was on the floor and needed help. It was apparent that he had pretended to fall, but Kathy loved him and cared for him so much that she couldn't perceive his pretentious behaviors. Apart from his unhealthy condition, he was a weak boy in character. He expected everyone to pity him. I think it's because of Heathcliff's manners toward him. He did nothing to encourage the boy or have self-respect. He wanted to lie on Kathy's knees. It reminded him of the past days that he spent with his mother. He wished to see her the next day. On our way back home, I opposed her intention to visit him again, but she would not listen to me. On the day of our visit to Wuthering Heights, my feet had remained in my wet shoes for a long time, and I was sick during 3 weeks. Kathy was the cheerful company, both for Mr. Linton and me. She really took care of us. Gradually, I was recovering and moving around the house. I asked Kathy to read me something. She did it twice, but unwillingly, and at the third she said she was tired and went to her chamber. After a while, I went there too, in order to check if she was fine, but she was absent. Then she entered from her window silently and saw me. She promised to say everything as long as I didn't scold her. Then she began. "I've been to Wuthering Heights since you were ill. Every time I went there to see Linton, I promised for the day after. The housekeeper, Zillah it was very kind to me. Linton had a very changeable temper. Sometimes we got on very well, but the other time we were on the verge of quarreling even about trivial matters. Once Hareton welcomed me at the door. While getting in the house, he pointed to the writing over the door and said that he could read it, but he failed to read the date next to it when I asked. I scolded him, saying that the purpose of my visit was not him, but LINTON. I interfered in this part, saying that she shouldn't have behaved in such a way toward Hareton. As I had looked after him for 5 years, I knew he was a very clever boy. However, it was Heathcliff's evilness and unjust treatment that turned him to an ignorant boy. But listen, Nellie, she continued. I entered and sat by LINTON. I had hardly started to read him something when Hareton came in with a fury and threw LINTON off his seat, saying, "Go to your own room, and take her there too if she comes here to see you." Getting us out of the room, he shut the door. LINTON was trembling with anger. He yelled at him, but suddenly started to cough, and blood came out of his mouth. Zillah rushed to help. They took him to his room and made me go home, saying he was much better. I cried all night for him. The next day, to my surprise, he blames me for the day before. I left upon his accusation, and then visited him again to say that it was our last meeting. I regret having showed you my bad temper, but Father scorns me all the time and makes me feel worthless. It's only you to be kind to me and make me happy, he said. He was right, and I felt I must forgive him, so that I kept going there. But please, Nellie, don't say anything to my father. I told her I would think it over, and in the end I decided to inform the master about her visits to Wuthering Heights. He forbade her to go there again, but he wrote to LINTON and let him know that he could visit Thrushcross Grange whenever he pleased. In his other letter to the boy, he expressed his desire to see him. I think if LINTON had been clever and strong in personality, Mr. Heathcliff would have certainly let him visit his cousin and uncle in the Thrushcross Grange. In his answer to his uncle, he said Mr. Heathcliff didn't permit him to visit them. But the latter parts of the letter gave me an impression that they were written by Mr. Heathcliff himself, because LINTON lacked such wisdom and patience. Instead of writing his complaints and pains, he requested to meet Cathy and him on the moors. My health is better, uncle, but if you deprived me of my best companion, how could I be cheerful and happy? It was Heathcliff who made him show such eagerness in meeting Cathy. He treated the dying boy tyrannically and forced him to do anything he wanted. We would learn about it later. As Mr. LINTON was getting worse day by day, I accompanied Cathy to the moors to see LINTON. Chapter 13. Imprisonment. Summer almost came to an end. Although it was hot, there was no sun on the day we would meet LINTON on the moors. But he was lying on the ground that was very near Wuthering Heights, instead of meeting in the middle. He looked really bad, but denied it and said he was fine. Trying to conceal her grief for him, Cathy mentioned about their dreams and the beauty of nature to make him cheerful. No matter what she talked about, it seemed impossible either to make him speak or amuse. It was best for him to go to his home and have a rest, but this suggestion caused him to be in panic. He begged for another 30 minutes, looking around him fearfully. "Cathy, please tell your father I'm healthy enough and be here again next Thursday," he said. "If you see my father, don't tell him that I have been very stupid and silent. Otherwise he gets angry and becomes hard." Then he fell asleep for a while. We waited for him to wake up to be able to depart. Suddenly he got up with fear, supposing his father called his name. He felt nothing but fear of his father that day. He seemed quite unconscious of what he did or said. Cathy couldn't bear any more and expressed her disappointment. When we got home, we didn't explain his situation to the master in detail. Cathy kept her promise, and 7 days later we settled for the moors. But we decided not to stay long because Mr. LINTON was very ill, and Cathy didn't want to leave his father alone. LINTON was lying on the same place and didn't seem pleased to see us. "You've been behaving so strangely for a week, LINTON," said she at last in an angry tone. "Be honest. What's happening? Don't you want to see me?" "Oh, Cathy, my life is in your hands," he cried. "But I cannot tell you anything because my father threatened me. I'm so afraid of him, I cannot." While he was crying, Heathcliff came. He commanded LINTON to get up. He was so powerless that he had difficulty even in standing without help. He trembled with a single touch of his father. They managed to convince Cathy to help him go home because it was apparent he couldn't have made all the way by himself, and even the idea of his father's company caused him to shake with fear. So we arrived at Wuthering Heights. I was waiting for Cathy outside while she was leading LINTON to his chair. But Heathcliff pushed me inside and locked the door behind me. We were trapped. Cathy struggled to take the keys out of his hand, but he prevented her from more efforts by beating her. There was no one at home except us at that moment. Heathcliff went out to look for our horses. We looked around to escape, but all the doors were locked and the windows were too small to let us out. In the absence of his father, we asked LINTON what Heathcliff's plan was about. "He wants us to be married," he replied, "but we should make it tomorrow because he's afraid of my dying, and he'll keep you here all night. If you obey him, he'll let you go home the next day and take me with you," he said. Then Heathcliff entered again and sent his son to bed. Upon learning his intention, Cathy knelt in front of him and begged, "Mr. Heathcliff, I promised to marry LINTON. Please let me go home. Otherwise my father gets worried about me, or at least send Nellie to inform him that I'm here and safe." "Your father's suffering satisfies me, little lady," he said, grinning. "Neither you nor Nellie will leave this place, and he will think you got bored of looking after such an ill man, and you wanted to enjoy yourself. You can't deny that you came here willingly. Nobody forced you, and it's impossible for you to leave here before you marry LINTON." Then we heard that 3 servants were sent to look for us from the Grange. Heathcliff ordered us to go to Zillah's chamber. In the morning he came and took Cathy. I remained there 5 days, seeing Hareton only. He brought me meals all of those days, but he was always indifferent to my desire to talk to him. He treated me as a prisoner. Chapter 14. Unfortunate Cathy. On the 5th day of my imprisonment, Zillah came to my room. "Oh, Mrs. Dean," she exclaimed, "everybody talks about you. It's said that you and Miss Cathy were sunk in the marsh. How long did you remain there? Was it Mr. Heathcliff that saved you?" "What nonsense are you talking about?" I said. "Oh, my God, your master is a real liar." "No, it was not the master who had said it," she replied. "The people of the village told me. Then the master said that you had been out of your senses for several days, so he waited for your recovering to release you. Now you're free to go home, but the young lady can only step out of this place in order to attend her father's funeral. He said so." Fortunately, Mr. LINTON was not dead yet, but he had 1 day left to live, according to Dr. Kenneth. I went downstairs to look for Cathy. There was no one but LINTON. He said she was in her chamber and wouldn't be let out. I got angry and ordered him to take me to her room. "No, I won't," he answered. "According to my father, I don't have to pity her, because she hates me. What she is concerned about is my money," he says. "Why do you think she came to Wuthering Heights? Is it because she hates you?" "The truth is that your father hates both of you. How can you leave her alone while she's suffering? You're a pitiless, heartless boy." "She cries so much that I can't bear it," he replied. "Anyway, now I'm pleased to learn from Dr. Kenneth that Uncle is going to die very soon. This means everything he had is going to be mine. Father says so. Once she showed the pictures of her mother's and father's in a golden case, and told me they would be mine if I took the key from my father and released her. I said they were mine too, and tried to get them, but she hurt me in order not to give. When I screamed from pain, Father came in and saw the pictures. First he hit her, and then he took her mother's picture and crushed the other one with his foot. Her mouth was full of blood. Since that day, she hasn't been talking to me. He didn't tell me the room she stayed in. I decided to leave there without seeing anyone and arrange someone from the Grange to rescue her. When I arrived at home, I immediately rushed to Mr. LINTON and told him that Cathy was alive. In those 5 days, he changed a lot. He was waiting for death. I narrated the whole story, skipping some parts of it in order not to upset him any more. He quickly understood the purpose of Heathcliff. What he aimed was to have his property by marrying LINTON to his daughter. So he decided to leave his property to trustees instead of her, and she would use her fortune when she wanted. This plan would prevent Heathcliff from having his property if LINTON died. The following morning, I went out to take Mr. Green, the lawyer, for necessary works after the master's latest decision. However, he was said to go to the village for business and would be able to visit the master on the other morning. The 4 men I sent to Wuthering Heights turned back without Kathy. To my surprise, she came by herself after a while. At last, LINTON couldn't bear her crying and took the room's key secretly, taking risk for the first time in his life, I think. Fortunately, Kathy managed to run away without anyone's notice. Before sending her to Mr. Linton's chamber, I advised her not to show her unhappiness to him. He should believe that she was going to be happy with LINTON. So he died peacefully by her side. The next day, we learnt that Mr. Green didn't come deliberately the day before because he started to work for HEATHCLIFF and was paid by him. With his orders, he came to ask all the servants to quit their jobs and leave Thrushcross Grange except me. After the funeral, we were sitting with Kathy and thinking on her future. We hoped that Kathy would lead her life in the Grange again, and I'd keep my former position. But evidently, this was a very optimistic view. We saw Heathcliff come in without knocking. He had already considered himself as a master. With his entertaining, Kathy intended to go out, but he grasped her arm, saying, "You don't go anywhere. I came here to take you home. I hope you won't encourage my son to do wrong from now on. He is afraid of me so much. He supposes that he sees me, even when I'm not near. According to what Hareton says, he wakes in his sleep with a scream and wants you to protect him from me. In other words, you must come with me for him. He's your husband now." I suggested that Kathy and LINTON should live here in the Grange. He said he was looking for a tenant for this house. I would carry on my duty as a housekeeper here, and he was considering to make Kathy work as a servant in Wuthering Heights. He ordered her to get ready. "I will come with you," she said. "I love LINTON, and whatever you do, you cannot make us hate each other. You cannot do any harm to him when I'm near." "It's not me who causes him to hate you," replied Heathcliff. "He has this feeling in his spirit. If he hadn't had a weak health, he would have done so much harm by now." "It's normal that he has a bad nature as he's your son," said Kathy boldly, "but I forgive him, and I pity you because nobody loves you, and you're all alone in this world. Your suffering is our revenge." Then she went upstairs to prepare her things. Only he and I remained in the room. He came to the same room 18 years ago when he made his last speech with Catherine. It was autumn again like that day. For the first time after that day, he looked around the room carefully. He examined Mrs. Linton's picture for a while. "I visited Catherine's grave yesterday," he said. The sexton was digging Mr. Linton's grave at that moment. I opened her coffin and looked at her. She was the same, and I could have lied beside her forever. I paid him to bury me beside her when I'm dead. "How dare you do such a thing?" I exclaimed. "You're an evil man. Are you not ashamed to disturb the dead people?" "No, it's her who has been disturbing me day and night for 18 years. Nellie," he replied, "you know I wanted her to haunt me on the day of her death. That night I went to her grave and dug it. I was going to take her out and embrace her. I had hardly reached her coffin when I heard a sigh just by me. I couldn't see her, but I felt her. She even accompanied me home. What a relief and consolation it was to feel her. Since then, I've seen her from time to time. She played games as she did when she was alive. I suddenly saw her while sitting. Then we walked on the moors. But then she disappeared. I got home quickly in case I would see her there. I slept in her room. I believe in ghosts, Nellie. When I couldn't see her, I got disappointed. That was a strange way of killing." I listened to him in silence. He fixed his eyes on the fire. After he finished his talk, the sadness on his face seemed to disappear. He approached Catherine's picture, took it, and gazed a long look at it. At that time, Kathy entered and said she was ready. "Send this portrait to me tomorrow," he said to me. Then turning to Kathy, "You will come with me without your horse," said he. "From now on, you will go on foot if you need to." "Goodbye, Nellie," said she while embracing me. "Don't forget to visit me." "No, Nellie," the cool man interfered. "I don't want your presence in my house. If I want to talk to you, I'll come here and see you." He held Kathy's arm. Although she resisted first, she had to obey him. She turned her head and looked at me so sadly that I was on the verge of crying. I looked behind them till they were invisible among the trees. Chapter 15. The News from the Heights. I have tried to visit Cathy several times since the day they left, but they didn't let me see her, saying that she was busy. If I hadn't come across Zillah on the moors from time to time, I wouldn't have even known who was alive and who was dead at Wuthering Heights. I could easily understand from her way of talk that she dislikes Cathy. According to Zillah's account, on her day there, Cathy wanted her help. However, Heathcliff heard her request and told Zillah to mind her own business, and that Cathy should do her work by herself. Zillah obeyed her master from the beginning to the end in order not to lose her job. Cathy closed herself in her room all night. In the morning, she asked Heathcliff if they could call the doctor Kenneth, as LINTON was very ill. "We know that he's very ill," said Heathcliff, "but nobody cares about him here, because his life is not worth living. If you care, look after him and be his nurse. If you don't, then get out of his room and lock his door." Upon this unsuccessful and disappointing venture, continued Zillah, she tried to receive my help again, but I rejected it, being faithful to the master. As none of us visited LINTON, we were not aware of his situation, but it was apparent from Cathy's appearance that he was seriously ill. She looked pale and sleepless. Once or twice I witnessed her crying on the stairs at night. Although I was sorry for her, I decided not to interfere because I dared not to oppose the master's orders. That night she wanted my help for the last time. She asked me to tell Mr. Heathcliff that his son was dying. I thought she was mistaken and that I shouldn't disturb the master. However, she was right, and LINTON died on the same night. All of us went up to his room. Cathy was sitting beside him. Mr. Heathcliff asked her how she was feeling. "I should feel fine as he is safe now," she answered, "but I don't. You never helped me during his suffering. I spent my whole time with him without any support from you, and now I feel like I'm dead too because you caused me to feel so." She really looked very bad and pale. I made her drink a little wine. The master ordered Joseph to carry the body of his son to another room. Hareton watched them in astonishment. But what he mostly cared about was Cathy rather than LINTON. In the morning, she couldn't make it to come down for breakfast. The master let her be on her own till the funeral and told me to take her to what she needed and wanted. She stayed in her room for 2 weeks. I tried to display a kind attitude toward her, but she didn't take it into consideration. Meanwhile, LINTON left the whole property he had from his uncle, Mr. LINTON, to his father, not to Cathy. Anyway, nobody approached her room except me, until she joined us with her free will when Heathcliff wasn't around. Her chamber was very cold, and she needed to get warm. She came downstairs and in black from top to bottom. Before she attended us, I warned Hareton that he should act in a kind way toward her. I helped him dress himself properly. In my opinion, he wanted to show himself acceptable and decent to Cathy. She came in the living room and sat on a chair far from us, next to the fire. After getting warm, she looked around and saw the books in the library. She stood up and tried to reach them, but couldn't. Hareton helped her get some books from the shelf. The boy seemed quite happy to be able to assist her. She turned the pages and looked up in them for a long time. While she was busy with the books, Hareton stepped back but did not sit in case she needed help. He began to focus on her. In the end, he couldn't help touching her curly hair. It was just an innocent and gentle touch. However, she got angry and asked him to get away and not to touch her again. So he sat down and whispered to me if I asked her to read something from the books she was examining. But she turned down our request and said, "I hate your hypocrisy. When I needed you, neither of you helped me. So don't pretend to act kindly to me. I have nothing to say or read to you. I just came here to get warm, not to enjoy you." "But I offered Mr. Heathcliff more than once," said Hareton quickly, "to wake me in case you need help." "Be quiet," exclaimed she. "I prefer going upstairs to hearing your irritating speech." Hareton carried on his daily works upon her scornful manners. Since that day, I've been stiff and proud as she is toward her. No one loves her among us because we think she doesn't deserve it. To our surprise, she also rebels against the master. After I heard the story of my unlucky lady from Zila, you cannot guess how I wished to have my own house and take her with me. Unfortunately, I can't afford it. I don't have such a power. Mr. Lockwood's narration. With the account of Zila, Mrs. Nellie Dean's story came to an end too. Meanwhile, I'm recovering gradually and gaining my health again. I have even made up my mind to ride my horse to Wuthering Heights to see Mr. Heathcliff. I will settle for London and stay there for 6 months. I am not considering spending another winter here, so he can find a tenant if he wishes. There was a calm and freezing weather outside. Before I set out, Mrs. Dean gave me a letter to take to her little lady. It was Hareton who met me at the gate. Mr. Heathcliff wasn't at home and was expected to arrive at dinner time. I decided to wait for him, so I went inside. Catherine was preparing the vegetables in front of her for dinner. She didn't raise her head to greet me. She didn't reply to my salutation either. I recalled Mrs. Dean's narration and thought about how this kind of life here at Wuthering Heights must have made her rude and disrespectful to others. I approached her and pretended to look out of the window while I deliberately dropped the letter on her knees. If she hadn't asked loudly what it was, Hareton wouldn't have noticed my action. I said it was from Nellie Dean. Just as she was beginning to read it gladly, Hareton grasped it and said Mr. Heathcliff should read it first. But he couldn't bear her crying and gave it back. "Oh, how I wish I could ride my horse there, Hareton," said she. "I'm treated as a prisoner here, and I'm tired of all these things." "Mrs. Heathcliff," I said, after a short silence, "do not consider me as a stranger. My housekeeper, Mrs. Dean, mentioned you a lot. She loves and praises you so much that she will get upset if you don't write something back to her." "I'd like to," said she, "but I haven't got anything to write. They even took my books from me. I used to busy myself with them. Mr. Heathcliff destroyed them, and I saw some of my favorite ones in your room, Hareton. This is an evil act because you don't even know how to read and write. I think you did it to deprive me of an occupation that I like." I felt I should interfere in this part because the boy got embarrassed. "Maybe he just wanted to have some knowledge about such books," I said. "Yes, I heard him trying to read to himself," she said, laughing at him. "It was extremely funny." "But it's normal for him to spell as he is a beginner," I replied, because I didn't want the boy to be discouraged. Hareton left the room and returned with several books in his hands. "Take them. I don't want to read or think of them again," he said to her. She opened one of them and read aloud in the same way as he read. Then she laughed and laughed. Hareton took them back with a fury and threw them into the fire. "Only a cruel person like you could do such a thing," cried she with tears in her eyes. Hareton turned his back and went out. I was standing by the door at this moment and saw Mr. Heathcliff enter from the garden gate. He looked at the boy while passing him and said to himself, "It is strange that I see my Catherine whenever I look into that boy's eyes." Then he approached the house with a confused expression on his face and saw me finally. "Oh, Mr. Lockwood," he exclaimed, "it's nice to see you again, but I wonder for the reason for your visit." "I will go to London next week, sir," I replied. "I will pay the rest of the tenant we have agreed before, but I won't spend next winter here, so you can look for another tenant if you like." Then he invited me to dinner. He got Cathy to do the service and ordered her to eat with Joseph in the kitchen, not with us. It was a boring meal with Mr. Heathcliff on one side and Hareton on the other. I cut my visit short and left. Although I tried to look for the young lady before departing, I couldn't see her. On my way, I thought that Cathy would have been happy and free again if she had desired to be with me. Chapter 16. A Visit to the Heights. I was invited to a friend. By coincidence, it was near the Grange, and I decided to call there to talk over matters with Mr. Heathcliff for the last time. What I thought was to spend the night there so that I don't need to take all this way from London again. It was a September day in 1802. It was fine, mild weather. I stopped to watch the scenery for a while. It was so beautiful that if it had been August, I could have spent one more month here. Before sunset, I arrived at Thrushcross Grange. Inside the house was sitting a 10-year-old girl knitting and an old woman smoking a pipe at that moment. I asked if Mrs. Dean was there. She said she had moved to the Heights. I introduced myself to her, adding that I considered spending the night there. The astonished woman stood immediately crying, "You should have informed us before. Your room has not been tidied up yet. It's not clean either. Oh, let me arrange your chamber and the sitting room quickly." Without wasting any time, she started her work. Instead of waiting for the preparations in the house, I preferred to visit the Heights. I entered its garden without any obstacle. The doors of the house were open, and I could hear the voices inside. What I saw through the window surprised me. Cathy and Hareton were sitting on the table. Hareton looked very handsome and respectable in his fine dress. He was reading something aloud, and Cathy was standing just behind him. Her hands were on his shoulders. She was encouraging him to read correctly. When the young man was successful, he received several kisses from the lady. Then he stood up too, and they directed toward the door in order to go out. I didn't want to be seen, for I might spoil their joy, so I hid in the kitchen. I came across Mrs. Dean there. We sat and talked for a while. After my departure, Zillah left Wuthering Heights. For this reason, Heathcliff ordered her to settle in here till my arrival. I said I came to finish my business with him. "What business, sir?" she asked. Then she added immediately, "Oh, I see. You haven't known yet that he is dead?" "Is he dead?" I asked, not believing. "How long ago?" "It's been 3 months since then," she replied. "Take your seat. I'll tell you everything." She offered something to drink and then began to narrate. Mrs. Dean's narration. When I first came here, I was shocked by Cathy's behaviors. Mr. Heathcliff didn't make any explanation about his wish to make me live with them. But it's evident that they couldn't get on well and that he couldn't bear seeing her twice a day. We spent most of our time together, with her in the sitting room. I brought her a lot of books. She generally occupied herself with them all day and seemed quite happy in the beginning. But then her good mood left her because she was forbidden to go out and wander by Heathcliff. She didn't have any company except me, so she got bored. She went to the kitchen from time to time and quarreled with Joseph, or else she mocked Hareton's stupidity, although the boy didn't reply to her scornful comments or questions. I interfered most of the time while she was making fun of him. However, what she was also trying was to approach him, not merely to laugh at him. Her first attempt to be friends with him was to leave a book in the table drawer. She whispered to me to observe him whether he would take it or not. She was upset the following morning when she learnt he didn't take it. She began to follow another way to encourage him to read. We spent the whole day in the sitting room, and Hareton sometimes accompanied us too. In those times, Cathy took one of her favorite books and read aloud to us. At the most interesting part of it, she stopped reading and left the book open on the table. But he didn't act as she expected again. Meanwhile, Heathcliff isolated himself from the people around him. He didn't want even Hareton around him. One day, Hareton shot himself accidentally while he was on the moors and lost a great deal of blood. He had to sit by the fire doing nothing. Cathy wanted to make use of those times and did her best to be friends with him. She tried to explain that she didn't mean to hurt him when she called him stupid, but the boy's heart was broken apparently, so he scolded her and became sulky again. "I don't hate you, Hareton," cried she, "but obviously you hate me like Mr. Heathcliff does." "Don't lie," he replied. "It was me who was scolded by him, as I defended you, but you kept her mocking." "I didn't know that you had defended me against him, but now I want you to forgive me for those I had done to upset you," said she. Then she went by him and put a kiss on his cheek, as a way of her peace agreement. Hareton remained silent and seemed a little bit embarrassed. She prepared a present for him, which was a book written Mr. Hareton Earnshaw on it. She told me to give it to him. "If he accepts it, I'll teach him to read correctly. If he doesn't, I'll never tease him again," she added. A few minutes later, we heard the cover being opened, so Cathy went and sat by him joyfully. They bent over the pages and studied it carefully. They got closer day by day. If I could be lucky enough to witness their marriage, there's no doubt that I will be the happiest woman in England. Chapter 17. The Winds of Change. Hareton was still unable to do farm work, continued Mrs. Dean, so he usually did easy work that did not hurt his arm. Cathy went out too, and they began to make plans about the arrangement of the garden. Unfortunately, they chose a wrong place to plant the flowers Cathy wanted. They destroyed Joseph's favorite bushes. I was shocked by their thoughtless behavior and warned them against the fury of both Joseph and the masters. We had our dinner all together except Joseph. At the table, Cathy was constantly teasing Hareton quietly. The boy was on the verge of laughing, but he couldn't, of course. The master wasn't aware of their nonsense at first. However, Hareton couldn't endure any longer and laughed. Heathcliff raised his eyes from his plate and looked at them. "You are as lucky as I cannot reach you now," he said. "It was me," said Hareton immediately. Saying nothing, Heathcliff went on eating. At that moment, Joseph came in and informed him about the situation of his plants. He was so angry that we could hardly understand his speech. He complained about Hareton as he became disobedient to him and was affected by Cathy. He said that he had pulled his bushes out. "Why?" asked Heathcliff, looking at the young man. "We wanted to plant some flowers," replied Cathy, before Hareton could talk, "and it was me who made him do it." "How dare you wish such a thing in this land?" Heathcliff asked in surprise. "And you, Hareton, why do you obey her?" "You took all our land and money," said she boldly. "As we're friends with Hareton now, he will learn the facts about you from me, and if you ever tend to hit me, Hareton will do the same to you." Heathcliff ordered him to take her inside. The young man tried to calm her down. He was stuck in between them. However, Cathy didn't leave the room, and Heathcliff grasped her curly, beautiful hair. His looks were so full of fury that Hareton and even me were about to interfere. But he suddenly set her free and looked at her carefully. "You shouldn't provoke me," he said. "Now I don't want to see any of you. Leave me alone." The same day, the two cousins were sitting and talking with the relief of Heathcliff's absence. Cathy mentioned the relationship, or the hostility we can call it, between his father and Heathcliff. But the boy considered Heathcliff as his father and the Heights as his home, so a bad word about him would upset him. She understood she would have behaved cruelly toward Hareton if she talked badly about Heathcliff. From that day on, she avoided saying unpleasant things about him while she was with Hareton. I was glad to see them be in good terms. One was a patient teacher, the other one was an eager student. After I had finished my work, I sat with them and watched them studying. It was such an enjoyment for me, too, that I couldn't understand how time passed. Hareton has improved very much since they began the lessons. One could see the reflection of his intelligence on his face. While I was thinking about this, the master came. The two cousins raised their eyes from the book to look at him. One was 23, the other was 18, and both of them had the eyes of Heathcliff's Catherine. This resemblance must have prevented him from acting an evil man toward them. He just went beside them and examined the book in Hareton's hands. Then he told them to leave us two alone. "It's funny, isn't it," said he, "that I have lost my former fury and the desire for revenge. I took an oath to destroy both families. Now I have a great power to accomplish it, but I feel that it doesn't amuse me any more to do harm. All my life I thought that I would take my revenge one day on the children of my enemies, because they themselves had already died. But I feel a change in me. Now it's not important for me to take revenge, even to live. I sometimes forget to eat something. These children remind me of a great number of memories with her. I sometimes wish they were invisible to me, but also not to be able to see them in her. Not only them, but also everything around me reminds me of her. I see her on the floor or on the wall, in every tree and cloud. It seems as if every object in the world tells me that I lost her forever." He seemed rather obsessed with her, but not mad. On the contrary, he was quite strong and fit as he had always been. "Are you not afraid of death, are you?" I asked. "Of course not," replied he. "I have a single wish, and I feel I'm getting closer to it day by day. I have been waiting for it to come true for too long." I wished this struggle would end very soon. Then, talking to himself, he began to walk in the room. Each day he was getting more isolated. When we sat together for a while, he didn't talk much. Chapter 18. New Beginnings. A few days after our talk, Mr. Heathcliff's attends to dinner became seldom. It was not because he didn't want to see Hareton and Cathy apparently, but because eating once in a day was sufficient for him. It was one of his strange habits that he had displayed for the last days of his life. One night I heard him go out after we all went to sleep, having finished our dinner. He was absent even in the morning. It was a nice spring day, so we decided to lift a table to the garden and sit there after breakfast. Cathy and Hareton were arranging their plants. In order to pick up some primrose roots, Cathy made her way to the gate. On her return, she was puzzled. She said Mr. Heathcliff was coming and that he even talked to her. She added that he looked very much pleased and joyful. He approached us with a bright look in his eyes. He didn't want to have breakfast. Getting irritated by my warnings that he shouldn't stay out at night in that season, he ordered us all to go inside and not to disturb him. Although he was willing to eat his great portion of lunch at first, he suddenly stood up at the window and went out. Hareton followed him to ask the reason for his not eating, but was sent back receiving the reply, "I wonder how you could wish other people's company while you are sitting together with her." When Heathcliff entered again, there was that same strange gladness on his face. I tried to learn what his extraordinary situation sprang from. He mocked my curiosity and said incomprehensible things, such as that he was in his heaven. I left him on his own and didn't visit till the evening. When I went up to him at last, I saw him standing still in the dark room. I approached him in order to close the window. However, I was so frightened by the expression on his pale face that I dropped the candle and we remained in the dark. So I went down to bring another, but I couldn't dare to go by him again. I requested from Joseph to do that task. He returned with the candle. The master decided to go to bed. Instead of directing himself to his room, he made his way to the room which had wide windows. One could easily get through in order to go out. I had no doubt that he preferred there for his night tour. In the morning, I found him talking with Joseph about the farm and the kitchen. There was more excitement on his face this time. I prepared his breakfast and coffee. I insisted that he eat something, but he was under the influence of something invisible and claimed that we were not alone in the room. He was either looking at the wall or turning his head from left to right as if he was watching something on the move. He was smiling to himself. He really seemed to be out of his senses then. He attempted to reach his bread once or twice, but didn't touch it. As he had said before, he began to forget to eat and drink. Another day, he arrived after midnight. He went into the same room. I couldn't sleep that night, so instead of confiding myself to my curiosity, I got dressed and went down to the kitchen. While passing that room, I heard him speaking, and I also heard the name of Catherine. After a while, he came to the kitchen too. "I'll visit my lawyer this morning," he said. "I haven't written my will yet. While I still have enough wits to arrange these kind of matters, I had better get this task done. But I don't know to whom I will leave my property." "I think it's wrong to speak so," I interfered, not bearing any longer. "Don't you regret the injustices you have done to these people?" "I don't think that I have been unjust," he replied, "so I don't regret anything. I'm happy." "You call this happiness?" I said in astonishment. "Then let me give you some advice, master. You have been leading a selfish life far from Christianity and the Bible since your childhood. Why don't we call a minister to help you, have knowledge of our religion, and be fit for heaven?" Your words reminded me of the way I desired to be buried. I want it to be performed in the evening. Be alert that the sexton should do his work as I ordered. You and Hareton may come if you wish. No need for a minister, and no need for any prayer, because I will have already attained my wish by that time," he said, grinning. Then he departed for his room, so I was relieved. To my disappointment, he came to the kitchen the other day and wanted to converse with me. I told him openly that he made me frightened of him with his unusual talk. "I know I'm an evil man in your eyes," he said. then turned to Cathy, who was behind me at that moment. "Don't you want to accompany me? I promise I won't hurt you. But no, you don't want a conversation either. Anyway, I know somebody who likes my company." Throughout the night we heard him talking to himself in his room. In the end, I sent Hareton to fetch Dr. Kenneth. However, he had locked himself and wanted to be left alone. While I was wandering in the garden the following morning, I saw that the window of the master's room was open. It had rained all day the night before, so he can't have been in bed, I thought, because the bed was just under the window. If he were there, he must have got soaked. With this in mind, I hurried to his room, finding a key that unlocked the door. I found him lying on the bed. He seemed to be smiling. He was wet. When I approached him, I noticed that he was dead. His body was stiff and cold. I tried to close his open eyes, which had frightful looks, but I couldn't. With a terrified scream, I called Joseph. The old devil seemed to be pleased with his death. Hareton was the only one who really suffered. He spent the whole night in his room, kissing his face and crying bitterly for his loss. He was buried as he wanted. It was Hareton, Sexton, and me who attended the funeral. After his death, there happened many rumors about his wanderings on the moors or near the churchyard. These are the tales of the country people, of course, but I experienced a strange event a month ago as well. While I was on the way of the grange one evening, I came across a boy. He was standing with his sheep and 2 lambs and crying. I approached him and asked what had happened. "I saw Heathcliff and a woman over there," said he, pointing at the land further, "and I cannot pass them." I showed him another road to take. I think the boy was influenced by people's talk, so he imagined the figure of Heathcliff himself. However, I cannot go out alone at night. I cannot stay in this house on my own either. I'll be really pleased if we move to the Grange soon. So Mrs. Dean finished her story for the last time. I learnt from her that Hareton and Cathy are going to marry and reside in Thrushcross Grange. It is Joseph who will take care of Wuthering Heights. At that moment, we saw the couple return from their wanderings on the moors. They really seemed to be in love. With this realization in mind, I felt I should leave there before they came in. I quickly bade Mrs. Dean farewell. Just as they entered the house door, I went out from the kitchen. Before going home, I visited the graveyard. The 3 of them were sleeping side by side. I walked around them. There was a soft wind blowing over the green grass, and there were beautiful flowers. May they rest in peace, I thought.